Thanks, Nancy. Thanks to all of you for coming to this conversation with Eric Alterman about his very timely new book, History of America's Fight Over Israel, copies of which are available for sale and signing after we're through. Eric, why don't you come up and join me? Or you can keep it in the stand if you want to find your back. As you may know, Israel has been marking both its 75th anniversary and the annual memorial for its fallen heroes at a uniquely troubled time in its history. In America, the debate has run from even before Israel's declaration of statehood in 1948 to current escalating cycles of Palestinian-Israeli violence and counter-violence under the restored leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, along with continued expansion of settler homes in Arab territory and proposed changes to Israel's judiciary that's brought hundreds of thousands of Jewish protesters into the streets there. A veteran columnist and critic for publications including The Nation, The American Prospect, The Forward, Eric is Distinguished Professor of English and Journalism at Brooklyn College. His dozen previous books include Who Speaks for America, Why Democracy Matters in Foreign Policy, and When Presidents Lie, A History of Official Deception and Its Consequences. Eric has been following various aspects of the America-Israel debate in his studies and work over 40 years. And even before the latest explosive turn in Israeli politics and policies, he knew he was wading into controversial waters. Early in the new book, he writes, quote, "I don't doubt that this work will invite considerable criticism by those who see their own side treated in a manner they consider to be unsympathetic or lacking in the crucial fact or insight that would, in their eyes, undermine my entire analysis. But I know everybody here is going to be cool." So, Eric, if I may, let's begin at the beginning, at least in modern times, not the Bible. Talk about the pressures on President Harry Truman over recognizing a new Jewish state as it broke free of the British mandate. Why was the U.S. State Department under World War II hero George Marshall so opposed?
Hi, thanks for having me, everybody. Sorry I'm late. The thing about Israel, and particularly about Israel and Palestine, everybody hear me all right? Is that everything is complicated. Like, I could spend the rest of the afternoon answering that one question. I'll try not to. But as I'll do this as concisely as I know how. Harry Truman, the question that I asked in the first 4 chapters of the book is, why did Harry Truman recognize the state of Israel 11 minutes after David Ben-Gurion declared it to be on, I guess, May 14th, 1948? May 12th, May 14th. And the reason I want to ask that question is because the entire national security apparatus at that time, including, as David said, George Marshall, who, after Dwight Eisenhower, was undoubtedly the most respected American there was at the time, were dead set against it. The CIA was against it. The War Department, which became the Pentagon, was against it. The State Department was very much against it. Dean Acheson was against it, who was a deputy of George Marshall. They were against it because they cared very much about the strategic area where the oil was. They were against it, along with a lot of Republicans, because they thought that that Jews were naturally communist, and that Israel would be sympathetic to the communists. And actually, the leaders of the founders of the state of Israel were socialists, so they didn't really distinguish between socialists and communists. And they were anti-Semites, most of them. It was no longer respectable to be an anti-Semite in public after the discovery of the Holocaust, but it didn't necessarily change the attitudes that people had grown up with. Now, Harry Truman was also casually anti-Semitic in the way that many Americans were. One thing that shocked me in writing this book is just how anti-Semitic the country was in the 1930s, where if you added the number of people who said that the Jews were responsible for the way that Hitler was treating them somewhat or completely. You got very near a majority. In the 30s, they didn't really know what was happening. In any case, now Truman, he had two reasons for going against his entire national system and risking the wrath of Secretary Marshall. One was that, politically speaking, it was the right thing to do for a Democratic president who wanted to be elected for the first time. He hadn't been elected when he took over Roosevelt's presidency. Jews were located in urban areas that a Democrat needed to win. And they were understood by his then very young, smart political advisor, Clark Clifford, to make a difference in whether or not the president had a chance of winning. But actually, Truman, he really cared about the refugees. From the beginning, he sent people to Europe to report back to him on the state of the refugees who were not being allowed into Palestine by the British. And they reported back to him that they were being held in camps that were not all that different from the concentration camps that had held them. There were about 250,000 of them. And no country would take them, particularly not the United States of America. And there was no argument about this. The Jewish organizations were not arguing to let the Jews in because they knew how unpopular that idea was. So the only place they could go was Palestine, but the British wouldn't allow it, and then the British said, we've had enough, because they couldn't handle it. This was in part the result of the effectiveness of Jewish terrorism by the Irgun and the Stern gang, led by Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, two later premiers of Israel. There's a book that argues that these terrorist attacks on the British were the most effective use of terrorism known to militarism. And it worked, and it helped take the British out, and they turned it over to the UN. And the Palestinians refused to cooperate with the UN, which was a terrible mistake on their part. Now, they had and I'll stop, this is a really long answer. They had a really unfair deal. They were 2/3 of the population of the country, and yet the UN was giving the Jews 2/3 of the country. But they didn't engage, and as well as their lack of engagement, they got a raw deal, and then you had the war, etc., that Israel won. And so you got a state of Israel. Had there been another solution other than the state for those refugees, this is my point, there wouldn't have been a state. The reason that Truman supported the state was because there was nothing else to be done about those 250,000 refugees, and he couldn't live with that. So it was actually, in this case, the moral and the political reasons reinforced one another. And the strategic arguments of the State Department and the War Department and the CIA all went out the window.
You suggest that Truman, who was a Bible reader, also appreciated the story of the Jews' survival in biblical days and almost saw himself writing a late last chapter if he created a state or got them back home.
Yeah, well, the Palestinian Jews, Truman really cared desperately what Chaim Weizmann thought about it. Chaim Weizmann, who I'm told I'm related to. People always ask me when I'm in Israel, are you related to Natan Alterman? And I say, no, but I might be related to Chaim Weizmann on my mother's side. And that makes it okay. My mother's maiden name was Weizmann. In any case, Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of Israel and was the leader of the Zionists in England, Truman really loved this guy. He was a great scientist. And the people around Truman knew that Truman loved this guy, so they were always trying to get Weizmann into the Truman. And Weizmann told Truman that there was going to be another chapter of the Bible, and he was going to be in it if he supported Israel. And it's unclear whether or not Truman believed it, although he did once say, I am Cyrus, as if he were playing the role of Roman king. But yes, Truman did read, Truman did read, he said he had read the entire New and Old Testament 3 times by the time he was 14. And this has always been a profound weapon that the Israelis have used with a Christian president. And they know it, and they like it.
One of the other big surprises in your book was not only did the major Jewish organizations realize how difficult it would be to get those refugees into the U.S., but they had fears about the Jewish state as well, which I thought was surprising to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, again, this would take all day, but I put it down for you. Here's the thing. There were two great Jewish immigrations into the United States. The first one, the much smaller one, were German Jews, and they were all Reform Jews. And they came in the 1830s and 1840s, and they were very wealthy and very well educated, very well to do. And they believed themselves to be Jewish only by religion. They did not believe that they shared anything particularly in common with the rest of the Jews in the world. And they basically wanted the Protestants to think of them as Protestants, except that they happened to have a different religion. And then they were, and so they thought that Zionism, which was based on Jewish peoplehood and was going to create at that point a commonwealth, not necessarily a state, that would cause the Protestants who were in America to think that they were disloyal and not patriotic, and would screw up all of their success. But then, and that's why they opposed allowing the Eastern European Jews to come here when they were being persecuted in Russia and Poland, etc. But then things got so bad there that they gave up resisting it, and the Jews came over, which is by far and away most Americans, where most Christians come from. There's about 2 million of them. So there were 250,000 Germans and 2 million Eastern European Jews by the time the immigration was over in 1924. And so the Germans, they ran things. They had all the money, they had all the institutions. They created the American Jewish Committee, which was like the Supreme Court of American Jewry. And they wanted nothing to do with the state of Israel because, again, it contradicted their idea that Judaism was just a religion and not a people, and it called into question, they thought, their loyalty. Now, the person who transformed this understanding was Justice Louis Brandeis, who became head of, he was a German Jew, Supreme Court justice, but he was a hero to the Eastern European Jews because he had defended them in their labor struggles. So he was like the perfect man to be a bridge between the two communities. And he got talked into being the head of the American Zionist organization. And he came up with this idea that Zionism was necessary for lots of Jews all over the world because they were being persecuted, but not for American Jews. American Jews were cool. America was their Zion. But so Zionism, the first chapter of my book is called Zionism for Thee, but Not for Me. American Zionism became about helping Jews, other Jews in the world, settle in Palestine and build first a commonwealth and then a state, but not American Jews. So the German Jews were never entirely comfortable for this with any form of peoplehood, but they realized that they were overwhelmed by numbers, and they made peace with it over time. So the argument ended once it became clear that what was happening in Germany and under Hitler, the argument sort of became moot. The idea was there's no way to protect Jews in the future. We can't save them now. Very little can be done to save them in Europe during the war. That's an argument that one could have. But in the future, Jews need a place to be safe, and the only way to save them is for them to have their own place to live and their own sovereignty, and eventually that became statehood, and that's that story.
So Truman agreed to recognition, and soon support for the new Israel became a unifying aspect for all the differing approaches to American Judaism, from ultra-Orthodox to Reform, solely cultural. Positive media treatment, journalistic, novelistic, even cinematic helped. Talk about you call it the idealized dream world that was being created in American minds, and especially the Exodus factor.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting paradox. Talking about Israel from the time of its founding until 1967, it wasn't that big a deal for American Jews or for Israel or for America itself. American Jews were incredibly supportive of the creation of the State of Israel. I would say it's the largest lobbying campaign in all of history. There were many towns that sent more postcards to Congress and to the president than there were people in those towns.
Yes.
And the amount of money raised was, again, unprecedented. But after the state was founded, everything sort of went back to normal. And Israel was seen in the media and in Congress as a kind of Disneyland of these wonderful people are making the desert bloom, and they're writing novels in the morning and farming in the afternoon and making love in the evening. And every once in a while they have to fight in a military battle, but they win. And then this idea was incredibly romanticized in the novel Exodus. I guess I'm older than most of you here. But when I was growing up, Leon Uris said he wanted to write another chapter of the Bible. And when I was growing up, it was like, in suburbia, it was like the Bible. Every time I'd sleep over at one of my friends' house, they would have this blue and white book on their shelf. And the movie, Exodus was the best-selling book of its time, aside from Gone with the Wind. It went through 60 printings. And it's complete nonsense. But it became the truth. And then it was made into movie. My actual friend, Paul Newman, the movie that Paul Newman made before Exodus was called The Young Philadelphians, where he played a mainline lawyer. It's a good movie. And it's like the same guy. He's playing Harry Van Kennedy. He dresses like a Philadelphia lawyer. And the movie's even worse than the book in terms of its history, because they put Nazis in the Palestinian camp to fight the Jews, and it's incredibly racist towards Arabs. But it was enormously successful. The Israelis were just so thrilled with the propaganda value, they actually shut down the whole port of Haifa so that a lot of premature could film that day. And they provided, this is crazy, it's a crazy number, they provided 40,000 extras for the scene where Ben Gurion declares the State of Israel. 40,000. And when the book came out, Golda Meir, who was then the foreign ministry, said we can just shut down our propaganda operations. This book is all we need. And then El Al created a tourist trip to go see the fictional places in the book. So it was an amazing phenomenon, and it laid the groundwork for what happened in 1967 when this period where I'm talking about, where Israel was not very important to American Jews or to American generally, became the single focal point of American Jewish identity.
Some deeper thinkers saw the potential for trouble. An American philosopher named Mordecai Kaplan thought Jews around the world would, quote, likely act as a brake on the chauvinistic tendencies that the Israeli struggle for survival is only too apt to arouse in the Jews of Israel. So why didn't Jews here take up that role with the leverage inherent in the private contributions and the Washington funding for Israel that they have been so successful in mobilizing?
Just the day before yesterday, I participated in a Zoom discussion with the Kaplan Institute, named after Mordecai, who is he's the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, which is the smallest of the 4 Jewish denominations. Most people probably have never even heard of it. But it's just obvious my parents belonged to a Reconstructionist shul when I was growing up, because they let my dad have sweat equity in it.
SAJ?
No, I told you I grew up in the suburbs. Yeah. Anyway, but Kaplan was also the most important 20th century philosopher of American Jewry. And he tried to modernize American Jewry so that it would fit people's lifestyle better. If you were a Jew, he thought you should be kosher at home, but it was okay to go to Chinese restaurants. And he was a Zionist, and he hoped to see Israel become a center of Jewish renewal. But clearly, a small country in the Middle East surrounded by hostile powers is going to have a different way of living and a different way of life than Jews in cities and suburbs of the United States or France, for instance, or England. And so he was hoping for a cultural renewal inside Israel that would radiate outward. And according to the discussion that I listened to, it's happening this week with all 16 past weeks of demonstrations against the current government, but all of the reconstructions, the many rabbis, they were all really down on the way things turned out. They were actually, Kaplan wrote a book called The New Israel, I think it came out in 1955, and the question that was posed to the group is, what would Kaplan think of Israel today? And everybody was very upset with the way things have turned out, vis-a-vis Kaplan's vision for Israel and the diaspora, and the way things have turned out. But again, the point that I would make in this, because I didn't write a book about Kaplan, I did see him once speak. He lived to be 102. The point I would make about him is that, or the point I was making then, is that there was a fantasy notion of Israel that was created in part by the Israelis and in part by Israeli supporters. And this fantasy notion was bought into by American Jewry. It was held very deeply by them. And that, for the past few years, has been what is under attack. That this idea, this idealized vision of Israel, which is adhered to by many Israel supporters and certainly by many quote-unquote pro-Israel organizations, is unsupportable by the reality, and that's where the battle lies today. So the question, I don't know that it matters what Kaplan would think today. He's dead. But the idea that there could be an Israel that actually inspired American Jews, well, it did for quite a while. It united them, and it gave them a purpose. If you ask American Jews what they believed before they bought into Zionism, they basically believed in liberalism. Like, you could have taken the Jewish organization's platform and put it into any of the liberal organizations like the Americans for Democratic Action, and you wouldn't have to change very much. Because theology didn't matter, and they just wanted to be good Americans. So that wasn't really compelling in terms of keeping the community alive, and Jews were, deciding not to be Jews. America was the first country ever where you could decide you didn't want to be Jews. So Israel and Zionism kept that community together for quite a while until it began to divide them as it does today.
You make a point about the feelings of shame and guilt among American Jews for what they weren't able to do or didn't think of doing before the war, before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, immediately after, and so there was a reluctance to be critical of this wonderland that was going up, which was being billed both as increasingly powerful, successful in combat with its neighbors, and yet somehow eternally vulnerable. And I quote you, herein you lay the origins of one of the many absurd aspects of American Jewish discourse on Israel, somehow both powerful and vulnerable. Give us your analysis of that and sort of the divisions that it's led to.
There's a lot of questions in there. One of the things that I get attacked for by conservatives who have written about this book is that they say that I say that American Jews gave up on trying to save the Jews in the Holocaust and became Zionists instead, and how convenient was that. They shouldn't have done that. And I don't say that. It's true that the Zionists were very much against putting any effort into saving the Jews in Europe, rather than, because they wanted those resources going into building up Jews in Palestine. But nobody really knew how to save the Jews in Europe. The argument over whether or not to bomb Auschwitz, I find kind of uncompelling in terms of would it really have saved any lives. I think President Roosevelt was probably correct that the way to save those lives was to win the war. Nobody really knows the answer to that. It's one of the biggest horrible what ifs of history. But it's true that that this vision that the Zionists were presenting, again, of this new Jew who was not afraid, who did not. One very uncomfortable thing about Zionism from the beginning is that it's a real strong anti-Semitic component as applied to diaspora issues. That they to some degree blamed the Eastern European Jews for their own vulnerability, their unwillingness to fight back, their weakness in the face of, all throughout history, Jews had not been strong in the face of their persecution. And that runs through Zionist discourse. And they were building this new Jew who would be tough, who could defend himself and herself, and didn't bow down to anyone. And it's still there. Israeli Jews still have very little respect for diaspora Jews. They expect diaspora Jews to disappear either because of anti-Semitism or because they will just assimilate into national life of wherever they live. So the way American Jews solved this conundrum was to identify with Israel. They became the center of their Jewish identity became support for Israel and adherence to what I think is a biblical view of Israel. And this sustained them for a long time because Israel was very much under threat, or certainly appeared to be. You could certainly make that case pretty easily. And there were certainly rhetorically, there was no support for living in peace with Israel in the Arab world. And so it solved all these problems for American Jews over what it meant to be Jewish and how to stay together. And you could raise money to support Israel in a way you couldn't raise money for any other Jewish cause. And you could bring people together. And so Israel became, I quote a famous rabbi saying that Israel was a kind of kidney machine for American Jewry that sustained them, and now it's kind of appendicitis.
By 2020, polling suggested that the notion of an increasingly powerful, even nuclear, yet still vulnerable Israel was losing its impact among Americans, American Jews, and especially the younger generation of American Jews. Give us the key findings there in a nutshell, because it seems to me that this goes beyond your analysis to what's actually happening.
Well, Israel, I'm sure you've all noticed, it's become a conservative cause in America. The Republican Party and the Christian right is 100% behind Israel. It's a shame for the Republicans that Bibi Netanyahu was born in Israel, because he would have made a very popular Republican presidential candidate. He might
At least a Fox anchor.
Yeah. And Democrats, there was just a poll for the very first time that had Palestinians as more popular than Israel among Democrats. It's been true for a long time among young Democrats, but now it's among a majority. It's still pretty close, but it's a majority. Whereas Republicans, it's 100% for Israel. So I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, Israel under Netanyahu, he's the longest serving president of Israel. I think he's in his 6th term.
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, yeah. It's an illiberal democracy. He's trying to make it more liberal. That's what all the fights are about. Just like the United States was becoming under Trump, and still might become, but like Hungary, like Brazil was under. It's a trend across the world where strong men use democracy to make themselves into autocrats, and it's very unattractive to young people. Now, there's something strange going on with Israel. Maybe it's not strange, but it's unique. Israel is the only putatively democratic country in the world that supports Trump that preferred Trump to Obama and to Biden. And here's a really interesting and, I would say, worrisome aspect, which is that young Israelis are more right-wing than their parents and grandparents, and young Americans are more left-wing than their grandparents and parents, and that's particularly true among American Jews. So American Jews are much more critical of Israel than are most Americans. American Jews, and particularly young American Jews, support putting conditions on aid to Israel to make it have a better, to treat the Palestinians better vis-a-vis their human rights, something that Joe Biden said he would never ever do. Bernie Sanders said he would do it, Elizabeth Warren said she would do it, but Biden says it's unthinkable. I can't even believe that they're opposing it, but it's a majority position among Democrats now. And as younger Democrats become older Democrats, they will become a stronger majority position. So now, I approach this from a slightly different perspective, which is that I feel that American Jewry there's no question that American Jewry is in enormous crisis. So the conservative movement, which has historically been the largest denomination among American Jews, has lost a third of its members in the past 15 years. And Reform Jews has lost almost a fifth of its members, and it would have lost a lot more, except some conservatives have become Reform Jews. Orthodox Jews the ultra-Orthodox are growing. Modern Orthodox are also in crisis. And I feel that the time when it made sense to identify one's Jewish identity with Israel is over. That young people no longer will say, I want to be Jewish because I'm a proud Jew because of Israel, which has basically been the argument I feel that American Jewish organizations have been making. And I think there's an opportunity and a necessity for American Jews to rethink what it means to be Jewish, something that Zionism made unnecessary for so long. That Zionism was the answer. Supporting Israel was the answer. Supporting Israel, remembering the Holocaust, and fighting anti-Semitism. I think these are negative and not positive ways of thinking about one's identity, and I think it's time to recognize that even if you support everything Israel has done and think it's absolutely necessary in the world, you would still have to admit that this tiny country living in the Middle East and having an entirely very different way of life and education and relating. Israel is it's never been a liberal democracy. It's been a country that has an Orthodox, that has one set of rules and laws for the Orthodox, one set of rules and laws for the secular Jews, and one set of rules and laws for the Israeli Palestinians, of which are 20% of the country. So it's a very different country than the United States. And to live vicariously through that country doesn't make any sense. Never did. But it worked for a while, and now it doesn't work anymore. And so I feel whenever I give talks on the book, you're supposed to say something optimistic, and most things I say are not optimistic, to put it mildly. But I say this is a moment where American Jewry can rejuvenate itself, and that's something that I take very seriously personally. I try to figure out, what is to be done in that respect.
I've gotten a number of emails from major Jewish organizations, normally steadfast behind Israel, taking a sadly more restrained approach. They talk about mission to the Holy Land for a better sense of the dynamics there. They acknowledge concern over all the unsettling developments. Do you see those organizations, to any significant degree, reducing their support of Israel, financial or otherwise, either to exert some leverage at this point or simply avoid being tarnished themselves?
Well, again, I would like to see some of those resources directed towards saving and reviving American Jews. I think Israel can basically take care of itself. It's got, I believe, the fourth largest army in the world. It's got a nuclear weapon. And again, the other thing that is people have trouble understanding is Israel doesn't really care what American Jews think about it or what America thinks about it. It's going to do what it's going to do. It makes its own decisions. Bibi Netanyahu was once taped secretly by saying, America is an easy thing to move. Don't worry about America. Israelis always had patience in a way American politics doesn't. So if the United States says to Israel, don't do this, Israel will say, okay, I won't do it. And then like 15 minutes later, they'll do it. In answer to that question, look, there are a lot of problems with this country, and there are a lot of problems with Israel. One problem with this country is we're not a very democratic country, right? There's all kinds of ways to get around what people want, right? Otherwise, we'd have gun control. Right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be the right to choice would not be under threat all over the so much of the country. So the major Jewish organizations, they're not like, they don't take polls of Jews and say, what do you think? They respond to their boards and their funders. And their funders are, by and large, much more conservative than American Jews are. So in the past election, in 2022, 70% of Jews voted for Democrats, and yet AIPAC supported 108 Republican insurrectionists, people who said that the election was stolen. Now, AIPAC is not a Jewish organization; it's a pro-Israel organization. It's got a lot of conservative Christians in it. But the Jewish world is very much disconnected from what polls of Jews say that they would like, and the groups that represent what Jews say they would like. A majority of which, as I said earlier, want to see the United States condition its aid to Israel on Israel's human rights record. They're very weak. They don't have the legacy support. They don't have the funders. They don't have the relationships in Congress. So the politics are very much behind the opinion, public opinion, both of Jews and of the country at large. And this is the problem of democracy. It's one reason why, again, I bum people out, you know. I mean, when I gave a talk in Tel Aviv, right before the book came out, at Tel Aviv University, and I made this point about Trump and how Israelis like Trump, and they're disconnected from American Jews. And a gentleman raised his hand and said, let's say I'm one of those Israelis who likes Trump and who doesn't care about you American Jews thing. Why should I care about this? We're still getting, you know, Barack Obama signed a $38 billion memo of understanding where the United States is going to give Israel $38 billion over a period of 10 years. It's nothing like it in diplomatic history. And when Israel had that war in 2021 with Hamas, and they used up, according to the Israelis, $1 billion worth of Iron Dome missiles, the missiles that shoot down the other missiles. So Congress said, okay, well, let's give another $1 billion, because they used $1 billion of the $38 billion. And Congress had a vote on it. And the vote was 528 to 8, with one abstention. AOC was the abstention. So for all of the talk about how the Democrats are turning against Israel and American Jews are turning against Israel, they got 8 votes out of 538 votes. It's not a big problem. So the Israelis say, well, what do we care? You know, we have the Christians and we have the Republican Party. You Jews can whine all you want. How many troops do you have? So my answer was this. I said, 2 reasons. And I'm not sure they're that compelling. But 2 reasons. One is, if you lose American Jews, you really are all alone in the world. Because these Christians who support you, they support you so that they can have Revelation. We can have the book of Revelations come true, and you can all go to hell. It's not really like the same thing. You know? And the second reason is that Israel is not understood the way it was when I was young and when I was in college. I was actually good friends with Tony Blinken when we were young. And I think the way Tony and I learned about Israel in our elite universities is a completely different planet than the way kids learn about Israel in their universities today. And those kids are the future Tony Blinkens, or junior Tony Blinkens, kids who will be populating the State Department and the Defense Department and the think tanks and so forth. And so the entire atmosphere of the way Israel is treated in the future will be different. Now, you can't really predict the future. Anything could happen. So maybe they don't want to worry about that either. Maybe they worry about tomorrow. But otherwise, this situation can go on forever, I think. I don't know what will happen in Israel with the demonstrations and whether or not the Netanyahu government will survive that. But fundamentally, I don't see the American government in any way walking away from Israel, and I don't see if I were a Palestinian, I would have no cause for optimism at all.
Okay, I think we'll give you the last word and see if there's some questions from the audience. I know we have another Mideast expert here, so
I guess I
why don't
just...
you say who you are?
Hi, I'm Fran Gordon. I'm a member of the club. Thank you, Nancy. And actually, I wrote a show about just all of this 13 years ago called Sacred Right, Sacred Song. So I have been on this as an American Jew with a deep Zionist core. And I guess I just want to say that, I don't know what I want to say. I found, first of all, I just want to push back that in terms of the Palestinians getting a raw deal back in the very beginning of all of this, I would ask you when you do your presentation to remember that Jordan is populated in large measure by Palestinians ruled by the Hashemite kingdom. You know how complicated it is, and I think that American Jewry cares a lot more about what's going on in Israel than I think you think, and I think what's going on in the streets in Israel, the fact that Bibi Netanyahu stayed away from the JFNA's General Assembly is a huge deal. So the question is, do you think it's a good thing that Bibi Netanyahu stayed away, and what do you read into the fact that the Prime Minister stayed away from the largest gathering of diaspora Jewry because of the concern about the judicial overhaul? Question, thank you.
Well, first I'm going to address the first thing about the founding of the state. And I would make 2 points. One is that, again, as I said, the Arabs were 60% of the population of the area of Palestine, and the Jewish community was given 60% of that.
Great, the desert.
May I finish?
Yeah, come on, Fran.
Okay, go on, but
The
it was the
second point
desert.
I would make is that the Israeli Defense Forces took credit before 1948 for expelling 700,000
Agreed.
Palestinians. So I think having your country given to a minority of the population, and then having that minority expel 700,000 out of a population of about 850,000, I think that works as a raw deal. I think the word raw deal applies there. As for Bibi Netanyahu not speaking to the World Center, that's internal Israeli politics. I wrote a book about the argument in the United States over the state of Israel, and the state. I mean, the book actually works really well as providing historical context for understanding this moment and this moment of confusion in the American Jewish community. On the one hand, you have young Jews who are either passionately involved in trying to speak on behalf of resisting the Netanyahu government, some on behalf of Israel's democracy, and some, many on behalf of the Palestinians, and believe there shouldn't even be Israel. The organization on campus, the Jewish Voice of Peace, which is anti-Zionist, claims to be the fastest growing Jewish organization on campus, period. Now, I don't know if that's true. I can't really prove it. But nobody keeps statistics on this kind of thing. But they're definitely there everywhere. You know, my daughter called me up from college and said, "Dad, it's Israel Apartheid Week. Why are we supporting crimes against humanity?" Like that's not uncommon. And a lot of these anti-Israel groups are run by Jews. So most Jews are uncomfortable with that. A very high number in one poll said that they thought that Israel was committing apartheid, and a weirdly high number even used the word genocide, the word I would never use, with regard to Israel's treatment of Palestinians. But there's no question that Israel treats Palestinians horribly in the West Bank and also inside Israel. Now, the argument is it somehow justified? And until now, that question was not asked, okay? The answer was always, shut up, you don't live here. It's none of your business. And that answer now, and then write the check. I personally got that answer when I was in Israel, when I would ask my relatives this question. And now the answer to that Israel is saying that is, okay, I will mind my own business, and my business is here. It's not there. You guys, best of luck to you, but I'm walking away. I'm either walking away from Judaism entirely, or I'm going to find my own path in the world as a Jew. So there's definitely a disassociation going on as a result of people being unable to integrate the actuality of Israel with what they were taught. Part of this is due to social media. In the past, there was a very narrow forms of getting information, and the Israelis and supporters of Israel were really, really good at narrowcasting that information. But now you can find out anything depending on what your belief is. You can go to your own, everybody lives in their own social media world. So young people are not getting their news from Dan Rather or Walter Cronkite. They're getting it from their friends. And so the narrative has broken down. And therefore so have all the old lines. And therefore I'm enormously unwilling to predict the future, except to say that if you read my book, you would not at all be surprised by what's happening.
Other questions?
I look forward to reading it.
One more question.
One more question.
One question.
Go ahead.
If American Jews don't support Israel, then who will? What happens if they don't? Does Israel survive?
Well, Bibi Netanyahu would say, it's fine. It's not a problem.
No.
And he has said that.
Yeah. But what does the American left say about the survival of Israel? And does it care? Because everybody now, the student body at CUNY, and you know as well as I, is hard left against Israel. And it's hard left against Jews on faculty. And it's hard left against retirees who are Jewish.
Okay.
So what's happening now? What happens to Israel? What happens to the Jewish community?
I will say that I must respectfully disagree as a faculty member at CUNY. I'm a distinguished professor. It's simply not true that the student body of CUNY is against Jews. And it's also not true that they're against Israel, because they don't mostly care about Israel. They're Jews. They're trying to get an education. They have full-time jobs. It's hard to be a Jew. They don't worry about Israel very much. There are pro-organized, I mean, I don't want to argue about CUNY, but to answer your question, the conservative Israelis who actually run both the recent government of Israel and the current government of Israel are not very concerned with what American Jews think about it. They feel, as I said earlier, they feel that they have the Republican Party, they have the conservative Christians, they have a very powerful organization in AIPAC that punishes their friends, punishes their enemies, and rewards their friends. And and it's always been this way. When Yitzhak Rabin was the ambassador to the United States under Golda Meir, he endorsed Richard Nixon in 1972. And the Jews, who remain the most liberal white people in America, were horrified. And they met with Golda Meir, and they said, this is terrible. First of all, you shouldn't be intervening in our elections. You're not supposed to do that. You're a foreign country. It looks bad. But second of all, why are you intervening on behalf of Nixon? By the way, he's an anti-Semite. And Meir said the same thing that Stalin said about the Vatican. She said to the rabbis, she said, where are your phantom jets? Okay? So as long as Stalin said about how many troops does the Pope have, and what they wanted to give the Vatican something, and the UN, they wanted to give it. Anyway, so she said, where are your phantom jets? Stop annoying me. So the American Jewish community, the liberal American Jewish community, is ignoring to the Israelis, but it's not important. And to be honest, they have contempt for American Jews in their religion. So the way they practice it. So the answer to your question is who is going to support Israel? Well, the conservatives are certainly going to continue to support Israel. And the center will probably continue to support Israel into the foreseeable future. In the distant future, I've given you a scenario where that support may become softer and more conditional, but I'm not confident about that. I don't predict the future. But I don't see that Israel has anything to worry about, or that you have anything to worry about, either with regard to CUNY or with regard to Israel. in terms of the current atmosphere, because I think Israel is in an incredibly strong position politically, if not in terms of popular opinion.
I'm sorry that we're out of time, except to remind everyone that there are books for sale and signing at the welcome desk outside. And so thanks again to Eric Alterman and to all of you who joined us today.